Hello! Welcome to Storytime with Waterford Libraries. Today we're reading a story about a little boy and his granny who has an ingenious way of figuring out how to solve his fear. It's called Going Potty by Eoin Colfer and illustrated by Woody. Chapter 1. For his 7th birthday, Ed Cooper's gran made him a train from egg boxes. An egg box train doesn't sound very exciting, but Ed's gran was an artist. She could make brilliant models from the stuff people throw away. Ed loved the egg box train. He drove his train through the kitchen, down the hall, and along the cracks in the yard. It was his favourite thing. Not bad for a piece of cardboard. One day, Ed forgot to put his train away. He left it outside. The rain came down and turned his train into a soggy lump. Ed was very upset. He went to ask Gran if there was anything else to play with. Gran was busy making a metal Tyrannosaurus. Something to play with, she said. Ed nodded and giggled because Gran had some lettuce leaves on her hat and a caterpillar was crawling across her head. Gran tapped her head. The caterpillar got an awful fright. Everything can be a toy, Ed, if you use what's up here. Take this, for example. Gran pulled a potty from the bottom drawer. This could be a racing car or a train driver's hat or even a ship's porthole. Ed was surprised. He'd used the potty before, but never as a toy. You see what games you can invent, said Gran, and I'll finish off this dinosaur. Off you go now. Ed dragged the potty into the yard and stared at it. After a while, he realized that the potty was like a big toy. Ed was just like his gran. He had a great imagination. Ed stayed out in the yard all morning. He had so much fun pretending to be a cowboy, a spaceman, that he forgot all about his egg box train. Chapter 2. The Potty Story. One night on a sleepover, Gran told him the story of the potty. They snuggled up on the bed together with the potty beside them. This was a special treat because usually the potty wasn't allowed on the bed. But tonight Gran had cleaned it specially. A long time ago, we bought the potty for your Uncle Pat. He loved that potty nearly as much as you do. Whenever he wouldn't sleep, we'd sit him on the potty and he'd nod right off. Ed laughed. Imagine Great Uncle Pat on the potty. The year after, the war started. We lived in London then. Ed nodded. He'd heard about the war. Every night, big planes would bomb the city. If the bombs got too close, my father would take us down into the railway tunnel. One night, we were all sitting down there in our pajamas. We were singing Christmas carols to cheer ourselves up when the bombs came really close. A big rock fell from the roof of the tunnel and clattered poor Pat right on the head. Luckily for him, he had the potty on his head, playing soldiers. So it was the potty that took the blow. Cracked clear in two, it did. Pat hadn't a scratch on him, although he couldn't hear so well for a few days. But what about the potty, Gran? Well, the potty was a hero, wasn't it? My father stuck it back together and I got the job of repainting the flowers. After all, it saved Pat's life. Gran put on her glasses. Let me see. There, look. Ed traced the crack she was pointing at. It ran all the way around the bowl. Exactly, said Gran. And that's why no one in this house minds people wearing potties on their heads. She kissed Ed and tucked him in tight. Wouldn't it be great? thought Ed. Sitting in a tunnel in your PJs, singing carols and wearing a potty on your head. Chapter 3. Down the corridor. After the holidays, Ed had to go back to school. Usually, Ed liked school, but this year was different. When you went into first class, everything changed. No more playing in the junior yard with the jungle gym and hopscotch squares. No more home time before the big children. And worst of all, no more using the special toilets in the infants' room. Now that you were 7, it was down the toilet, down the corridor and into the big boys' toilet. At the school, Ed climbed out of the car. He had a plan. His plan was not to go to the toilet until he got home. By the end of mathematics, Ed knew this plan wasn't going to work. A little pain in his belly was telling him, go to the toilet and fast. Ed raised his hand and waved it too, so the teacher would know he had to see her right now. Well, Ed, she said. Ed felt his face going red. I need to... But that was all he could say. It was no good. His lips had closed tight. Quickly, Ed wrote a message for the teacher. Okay, Ed, Miss Byrne whispered. You can go. Just next time, just wink twice, like this. Like a code, said Ed. That's right, like a code. Ed walked down the corridor to the boys' toilet. It was blue and covered in tiles, like a swimming pool. Ed held his breath and pretended he was diving into the water. This isn't so bad, he thought. He could make the toilets into a game, too. There was no one inside and no noise, except for the gurgle of water. Hello, said Ed to himself in the mirror and gave himself a little wave. Mirror Ed waved back. Then the pain in Ed's belly reminded him why he was there, and he went into the cubicle. There was a lock on the door, but the catch was missing. This worried Ed because someone could come in. The toilet itself was big. There could be a frog living in there. Ed shivered. He didn't like frogs that he couldn't see. Then Ed heard footsteps in the hall. He imagined shoes banging down the corridor on their own, with legs sticking out of them, and no boys on the top of the legs. But there were boys. They were talking and laughing. They're coming in here, thought Ed, to this very cubicle. Suddenly, Ed didn't want to go to the toilet anymore. Taking a deep breath, Ed threw open the door and ran out of the big boys' toilet. He didn't even stop to say goodbye to Mirror Ed on the way past. He was never going back. Never, never, never. He would just have to hold on until he got home. Chapter 4. Holding on until Ed got home was a big problem, especially after lunch. Ed wished that he could take the potty to school so he wouldn't get pains in his tummy. One day, Miss Byrne asked Ed a question. Ed, she asked, can you spell ambulance? But Ed could only think about one thing these days. Pardon, Ed? Potty, he shouted at the top of his voice. Miss Byrne blinked. Magella Dempsey stood up, even though you're supposed to get permission first. He said potty, miss. Ed Cooper said potty. The whole class laughed then, and Miss Byrne had to tinkle her quiet bell before they calmed down. Ed felt terrible. What did you say, Ed? Ed could feel his face go red. He had said potty, but he couldn't say it again, not with everybody listening. If only he could think of a word that rhymed with potty, then he could pretend he'd said that instead. But all he could think of was botty, and that was even worse than potty. Lucky for Ed, the bell for home time rang. After school, he ran straight out to the car without even stopping to talk to his friends. Later on, in Gran's, Ed was thinking about how the potty had saved Uncle Pot. He touched the potty. It felt smooth under his finger. Maybe, he thought. Gran, he asked. Yes, Ed. Do you think the potty could help me? Gran laughed. Maybe, if you have a potty type of problem. Ed's cheeks turned bright red again. He didn't like talking about the toilet, not to anyone. So Ed began to write his story down. By the time he was finished, Ed had written 4 full pages. He handed them over to Gran. Gran put on her glasses and began to read. Ed looked up at her to see if she was laughing. She wasn't. Gran was reading them very carefully. "Do you know what, Ed?" she said at last. "I think maybe that potty can help you after all." Chapter 5. On Monday, Ed had to go back to school. He was hoping that it would snow and he could stay home. But it didn't snow. The sun shone in a clear sky like a big blob of orange paint. Miss Burns was waiting for Ed at the classroom door. "Good morning, Ed." His teacher knelt down so her face was right beside Ed's. "Good morning, teacher." "A little birdie tells me that you don't like using the big boy's toilet," she said. Ed just knew his face was going red. "Well now," said Miss Byrne, "I think we'll have to do something about that." She took Ed's hand and led him down the corridor. Ed knew where they were going. Oh no! Miss Byrne was going to bring him into the toilet, just like an infant. But Miss Byrne stopped at the door. "Now, Ed," she said, "I want you to go in." Ed shook his head. He didn't want to. "Don't worry, Ed. Everything be all right. Use the cubicle in the middle. I think there's a surprise in there for you." So Ed went in. He looked around to check was he on his own. There was only him and the Ed in the mirror. The mirror Ed looked scared, but he couldn't run away. Miss Byrne was watching him. Ed pushed open the cubicle door and stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was a new catch on the cubicle door. Now he could lock the big boys out. This made him feel much better. There was still the toilet, though, and maybe a frog inside it. Then Ed saw his surprise. Someone had painted flowers all around the toilet. Lovely, colourful flowers, just like on Gran's potty. It was as though the potty was disguised as a school toilet, just for him. Ed climbed up on the toilet. He could feel the flowers under his fingers. He wasn't one bit afraid anymore. This was like being at Gran's. The potty had saved him, like Gran said it would. After school, Ed went to visit Gran. Ed ran into the kitchen. The wind chimes sang when he opened the door. "Gran! Gran!" he shouted. "You'll never guess." "Guess what, Ed?" she said. "The potty!" panted Ed. "The potty saved me." But then he stopped. Who had painted the flowers on the potty? Gran had. Gran winked at Ed. "You painted the flowers, Gran, didn't you?" "What flowers?" she said. Ed knew she was joking because of the smile on her face and because of the jar of paintbrushes still sitting in rainbow water. Ed ran and gave his grandmother a great big hug. "Thanks, Gran," he said. Gran brushed back her grandson's hair with her fingers. "You're welcome, Ed," she whispered. And that was Going Potty by Eoin Colfer and illustrated by Woody. Thank you for listening today to Storytime.